So now we are planning their funerals. We are at the funeral home. We're making the arrangements. My husband's family is coming into town later that week. It was a week in between their services, so they're coming into town. Um, I had a few days to write their obituaries, bring their clothes to the funeral home, and view them. I had to basically deal with the funeral home 3 or 4 times throughout that time before the funeral actually happened. So we get the dates, we get everything laid out for their services, the colors and everything, and now is going into writing, obituaries. I can remember I wrote my husband's obituary probably the next day and sent the pictures for the obituary, and I waited for my son. I asked his fiance to write his obituary as if she had known him when he was a kid and knew, they were together for 5 years. And I remember her saying, "Mama, I can get the pictures together, but I need you to sit down and write his obituary." And she was like, "And you can just tell me, what you want to write on the obituary, but I can't do it." And I just remember just boohoo crying, boohoo crying. But I sat at the park the day before the deadline to get the obituary writings and pictures for my son. I sat at the park and wrote his obituary. Sent the pictures in to the funeral home, and we went from there. We knew what we wanted them to wear. We knew that since my son was prospecting for SBR and my husband was a member for 6.5, almost 7 years for SBR, we knew we wanted something on them that represented their motorcycle club. So I made one phone call, to Nikki. She got that like the next day. She was like, I got it. I'll get the t-shirts, for them. We're done. And they got that over to me. We dropped it off to the funeral home. And here is the part that sticks with me. I've never been through a funeral process. So when I got to the funeral home, we had two of their riding t-shirts with their names on it with SBR across it in their pants. And I remember giving it to the lady, the receptionist, and I was like, "This is for them." So she opens the bag and she looks and she says, "No, we also need undergarments for them." And I was like, "What do you mean?" And she said, "I need you to go and get underwears, socks, t-shirts, if they wore t-shirts." She said whatever they wore when they were alive is how we dress them. And I was like, "Okay." And I just turned around and I walked out of the funeral home. Me and my daughter-in-law, my mom and my daughter were sitting in the car because they hadn't had enough of dealing with this process. So we get in the car, and I remember, I don't know if we went to like a Burlington or a City Trend, but we went somewhere around the corner and just kind of and bought the stuff to bring it back to the funeral home. And I can remember holding up a pair of socks and, boxers for them. And in the middle of the store, I'm just boohoo crying. And I'm just like, how is this my life? And why is this my life? Things of that nature. Like it just was so emotional. That was an emotional process. But we got it back to the funeral home, and now they're going to dress them. So they called me probably a day, probably that Thursday of the week of the services. They called and they told me that we have a final viewing. And the final viewing is you viewing your family member as if they are set up at wherever site you have them at. And I can just remember shaking so bad. I have already seen them, once, but it's like you have to see them again before the services and basically approve that you like how they look and it is okay to present them at the service. So now it is the Friday before the services, and my husband's father, His sons and his wife, they are all in town from Washington, and they met me at the funeral home. So it's me, my daughter, my daughter-in-law. My mom stayed in the car, but the funeral home basically have them set up in a chapel, well, where you can go in and see them. But the way how this chapel was, the doors was actually closed. It's kind of like a small kind of room area, but it is how they would be set up at their services. So I remember the doors opening to that chapel, and the smell of flowers. I hate the smell of flowers because it just kind of reminds me of a funeral home. It just hits me like a whirlwind. It hits my daughter. My daughter, who was 8 months pregnant at the time, she's standing there and she goes limp, like weak. We're not even in the room. The door's just open and it's just the smell of fresh flowers. And my daughter just goes sit in the lobby. She never comes into the room. My daughter-in-law grabs my hand, and she's like, we got to do this. We have to. Like, it's okay. Let's go in. We walked in. I didn't even look at my son. He was on the right side of the room. My husband was on the left side of the room. And I just turned my back to my son. And I just looked at my husband. And every thought, every memory I had of us as one family, I just stood there and I just cried and I just stared at him. And I'm just like, you're not coming back. Like, this is it. And I remember I turned around and I glanced at my son and I just got so weak. And I just sat in a chair. They had a chair at probably like by a window or something like that. I'm not sure if it was a window, but it was a chair. And I just kept looking at him, looking at his hair, looking at his hands. And for some reason, like, his hands was kind of locked in this position, like he was pulling a throttle down on the bike or something, or holding a brake on a bike. That's how his hands was locked. And I just could not look at his face.